Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next Future Leaders group of OpenUK's lunchtime training sessions on Fridays. Just a little bit of information about the Future Leaders group. We are a collection of individuals who are interested in open technology, open source software, open hardware, and open data. It includes a wide range of people that work in technology, intellectual property, outsourcing, procurement, data, and other areas, and is both made up of private practice lawyers, in-house counsel, and everybody else that works in the technology sector and related fields. It operates under the direction of the OpenUK Legal and Policy Committee and has a purpose to try and bring together future leaders in legal and policy matters and to also support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. The Future Leaders Group is currently co-chaired by me, Robert Grinnells from Phil Fisher, and my colleague Katie Gibson from Bristow's, and we're both lawyers who advise on technology and commercial matters. One of our current projects, which I'm going to plug in this recording, is the fact we are doing a public procurement review of UK government terms for obstacles that are preventing the adoption of open source software and open source software solutions and their partners. So if you'd like to get involved in that, please do drop us an email and we can share the information that we've got about these contracts and the process and also the table we're producing of our review, and you can get involved. We're using Big Blue Button today for this presentation, and just a few pointers. If you can stay on mute until the end, we'll come to questions at the very end of it. If you want to write your question, you can use the public chat function, and at the end we'll invite you to really come on microphone or on video to say it if you'd like to, or we'll just read it out if you'd rather stay quiet. And without any further ado, I'd like to pass on to Amanda to introduce our guest today.
Rob, thanks very much. That's a great introduction. You covered absolutely everything. Well done. What's left to say other than to introduce Andrew Katz? Andrew is amongst a number of roles, something that's not uncommon in open source. Andrew is the General Counsel of OpenUK, and with the support of his law firm Moorcrofts has provided us with excellent legal advice and supports our legal and policy group. I've known Andrew a very long time. He has been a leading light around open source software, helping to develop a number of legal projects, providing book chapters, etc. But he's also been instrumental in the Open Chain project. I'm sure he'll tell you much more about Open Chain. If you are not familiar with it, you will find that Sami Atabani of ARM provided the 22nd of May session for future leaders, and that is available on the OpenUK website, as this session will be afterwards. As I said, Andrew is a leading light in many open source projects, but in particular, he is the world's leading expert, in my opinion, in open hardware licensing. And I don't think there's much else I can tell them about you, Andrew. You like fine wine and kittens.
Yeah, yeah, excellent.
Not necessarily in that order.
No. Well, Amanda, thank you very much indeed for that. Rob, thank you very much for inviting me along. So I hope we're not sort of sick of Open Chain, but this is really a sort of different spin on that. So I'll do a brief recap on what Open Chain is about. But before I do that, I will see if I can figure out how to get screen sharing to work, because I haven't used this before. So hopefully we can now see some slides. So quick words. First of all, it says Orcro.
Andrew, I can't see the slides, sorry.
Okay. It does say it's sharing on my...
Rob, can you see them?
Can you see the slides?
No, I can't see the slides, sorry.
Right.
Do you want to try that one more time?
Yeah, I'll see. I'm not sure what the problem might be there. Again, it could be. Can you see? Is it you just seeing my video? Are you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, and we're seeing the slideshow with the Welcome to Big Blue Button page.
Right. Okay. Let's try this a slightly different way.
Unfortunately, I'm not much help because there are so many great people who want to speak for us. My presentation got bumped to September, so I haven't done this. Rob, have you seen any problems before?
No, this is, I don't know why it's not working.
Right, what I may have to, I think it may be because I've actually sent it to present the slides. I might just have to show you, you know, the sort of edit view of the slides. Let's see if I can get it to work this way. Right, application window. Yeah, presumably you can see that now. Can you?
Here we go. Screen share started. There we go.
Yeah, if that's okay. So anyway, sorry, it's not a full screen presentation, but anyway, there we go. So in the top right, you'll notice it says Orcro. That's because I have two hats on. As Amanda said, I'm a lawyer at Moorcrofts, but I'm also the CEO of our sister company, Orcro, which is a compliance business, and it's Orcro which mainly concentrates on the open chain side of things. So today I have my Orcro hat on. The reason that these documents are formatted, this presentation is formatted the way it is if you're at all familiar with the OpenChain documentation, you'll see that I've adopted the template of that. And the logic behind that is that ultimately I'm going to submit these to the OpenChain project as part of their training materials, and there's an awful lot of training materials that are available on the OpenChain project website. So hopefully that will be helpful. You'll also notice that it's released under CC 0, Creative Commons 0, which is basically the closest that you can get to a public domain release in most jurisdictions. So essentially you can remix, reuse, do whatever you like with these slides, and I will make them publicly available without any attribution or anything like that, although obviously if you do decide to add attribution, that would be gratefully accepted. So some of the slides I'm going to skip through very quickly because they are just designed to fit in with the format of the OpenChain curriculum. So this basically explains what OpenChain is. The core of the OpenChain project is the specification, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. I mean, if you've, as you say, listened to Sammy's talks, you'll be much more aware of what OpenChain is. So I won't go into any particular detail on that. And the curriculum is the set of slides and training materials that supports the specification. So what does a compliance program contain? Well, a typical compliance program, and obviously we're specifically talking about OpenChain here, it contains a policy which covers open source and includes things like the selection of code, maintaining a bill of materials, so all of the different code components that go into a particular build, the sort of criteria that you have when you're selecting code according to the various open source licenses that it has, the provision of compliance artifacts, which basically means that if you're shipping code that's based on open source, you'll have some obligations, which can be very light. They might just be providing a copy of a notice file, or providing a copy of the license text. But in the case of some licenses, as you'll be aware, the obligations could be greater in terms of having to provide source code, etc. as well. The policy would also cover things like training and awareness of open source issues and the policy itself. And then we need some sort of verification that individuals have taken and understand that training. And we need some mechanism for dealing with exceptions and queries from both inside and outside the organization. And then we'll typically have a policy that details how an organization will deal with third-party open source software projects. So the policy also needs to have a mechanism for ensuring that it's well understood and followed. It will typically have some sort of mechanism for updating it and changing it where necessary, and also a mechanism to ensure that the various roles that the policy specifies are properly funded and they have management buy-in, so they're given appropriate power so they can actually undertake that activity. And then a mechanism to review and update all of the above, basically. So that's a summary of what a typical policy should contain, and indeed those are all characteristics of the OpenChain policy. Now, what I'm going to be talking about in this talk is open source risks and benefit. Now, this is a sort of generic set of slides which is designed for people who don't necessarily have the level of understanding of open source that everyone on this presentation does. So I'm going to run through those pretty quickly. But then the meat of this is the M&A lifecycle and document section, where I'm going to be talking about how you can use OpenChain as a framework to provide a process and documents for M&A transactions. And then I'm going to talk about how we can align the transaction documents that you typically use in a typical M&A transaction, as far as the open source is concerned, with the OpenChain specification, and why that's a helpful thing to do. So open source risks and benefits, as I say, I'll sort of zoom through these pretty rapidly, but as we all know, open source is present in virtually all industries. A huge amount of software is now based on open source software. It's very much mainstream. It's very easy for any organization to become, in some sense or another, an open source software company, whether or not you're actually building software. An increasing number of outputs of organizations will incorporate software, and there's a very high probability that that software is going to be open source. And when we talk about software, we have a sort of very wide definition of what that means. So it's not only internally produced software, but software that companies use, and so on. But anyway, I'll skip over that because we're all familiar with that. And we're also familiar with the benefits of open source. So it inspires community and collaboration, which reduces development costs. It provides transparency in terms of what the code is, because you've got the opportunity to look at the underlying source code and how the software has been developed and put together. It can provide increased reliability, security, motivation to make the best product, because if you're making your source code available, then people are going to be potentially poring over that, and you can't hide your mistakes. Your mistakes are out there in the open. People will more easily be able to look at them. It's a way that developers like working. Developers like working in open source software, and if you're working in open source, you'll find it's easier to attract and retain developers. It can increase the speed to market. It's cost effective. It frees you from supplier lock-in, because it's easier to transfer to a different solution if you're using open source solutions. And it's mainstream. It's the norm. We know all of that. But that's by way of a little bit of background. So what are the risks of relying on software? Well, I mean, the reason open source is in brackets is because these are all risks that apply to all software, whether or not open source. And in fact, in many cases, the risk relating to open source is significantly lower. So licensing and compliance risk, we're talking here typically about risk of non-compliance with license terms. That can be breach of contract, and it can also be breach of copyright. There can be a security risk, because you could be using vulnerable software. If it's unpatched, it could have security vulnerabilities in there. There's business and operational risk, because it's possible that any code that you're using, again, this applies to any software, not just open source, is no longer maintained. And the question is, what are your competitors using? What are they relying on? If there's a problem, remediating it can be expensive. It can take time, staff, and money if there's a problem, if you need to correct bugs in the code. And then there's finally an issue around enforcement and potential litigation. If you're not compliant, you could find that you've got reputational risk. You could find that you've got reputational risk. So these are all issues to be aware of. So let's look at how this fits into a typical M&A transaction. So if we look at the M&A life cycle, I mean, the first stage is typically preparation and target screening. So that's the point at which you're looking at the target from the purchaser's perspective. It's the point at which you're looking at the target and determining whether that's something you actually want to buy, whether it fits in with your business, etc. Then you go on to a due diligence phase, where you would be crawling all over the characteristics, the information that you can find about the target, and the target providing you with a whole bunch of information. And then you'll move on to the transaction execution phase, which is where you're preparing the appropriate documentation to enable the transaction to take place. And then you'll move on to the integration phase, which is the point at which, after the transaction, you're in the process of integrating the target into your own business and making it part of your entire business operations. So if we look at these in slightly greater depth, then from a seller's perspective, so we're looking at conducting a detailed review of their own code base, making sure that it has internal policies in place and implementing them, and preparing document and materials for inspection, knowing that due diligence is going to be undertaken, and then preparing the strategy that it's going to undertake when the transaction starts to get underway. And from the buyer's perspective, the buyer needs to think about the internal policies that it's going to apply to the due diligence process, or to the whole of the transactional process. It needs to determine what its risk tolerance is. So what sort of risks it's prepared to accept, and within which levels, what sort of risks it's much less likely to accept, and then use those criteria when it's screening the business during the due diligence process. It also needs to prepare its strategy for how it's going to engage with the target, and what it's going to be doing as far as the negotiation process is concerned. And then it will also be, at the same time, it'll be preparing a draft purchase agreement as well. So the due diligence phase is the point at which there's solid information exchange. So information is provided from the target, about the target, from the seller to the buyer, and this is where the buyer aims to get a true picture of the target. So that will include, I mean, it'll cover a very broad range of things, obviously, but it'll include queries about the third-party software that it uses, the list of known third-party software, and also it will want to establish the risk of software compliance issues. Now, the reason I put that bit in bold is that it's not typically something that is particularly focused on in typical transactions at the moment, and I'll explain that a little bit of a greater depth later. So the purchaser will want to analyze the license terms that the target has acquired its software under and compare them with the actual use of the software to make sure that they're compatible and compliant. And it will also want to analyze policies and procedures around open source compliance. And again, that's in bold because that's not something that's typically concentrated on at the moment. And this is one of the things that I'm promoting with this talk, is the idea that this is something that's much more significant based on the current methodologies of software development. If there is some sort of problem, then as a result of due diligence, typically an output of that will be some form of remediation plan, which can involve updating the code, for example, if there's a particular problem with the version that's being used, it's got software vulnerabilities, or it could be if there's a problem with IP compatibility, so one of the licenses is not appropriate. It could be a question of obtaining authorization or a license from the original author of the software that's being used, or some other more typically straightforward sort of compliance issues around making sure that you're providing the appropriate, or that the target is providing the appropriate attribution notices, etc. So that's obviously concentrating on the software side of due diligence. At the same time, there'll be a whole load of other stuff going on. Accountants will be brought in to have a look at the company's financial records. If it's got property, then surveyors will come in and have a look at the company's premises and so on. So looking at questions like employment, etc. And we'll have a quick look at a real life due diligence questionnaire shortly, so you can get a feel for the sort of things that you typically see in there. So then after the due diligence phase, then you move into the transaction execution phase, and so it'll be the share or asset purchase agreement, which will typically contain representations and warranties and indemnities. So representations and warranties are provided by the buyer, and they essentially, what they're saying is that the information provided about the target to the seller is correct. And they're often focused on remediation and best efforts in ensuring that remediation takes place. But ultimately, if it doesn't, then that's what will generate some form of warranty claim. An indemnity is typically used to transfer risk, and in this case, it means that the risk of something, it may be the case where it's impossible to quantify a particular risk. The risk was completely within the control of the seller, and it may be possible to negotiate that the seller will maintain and keep that risk. So then, after conclusion of the execution phase, so after all documentation has been signed, then it moves on to the integration phase, which, as I said, is the point at which the purchase business is incorporated into the purchaser's whole business operation. So if unresolved issues remain after due diligence, then there's a number of ways which these can be dealt with. I mean, first of all, it may mean that it prevents the transaction from being included at all. It may result in it being a complete showstopper. It may result in delays in the closing date as the particular issues are dealt with, and it also may involve a renegotiation of the purchase price. So if you look at this from the perspective of the due diligence phase, then clearly the ability to respond rapidly to queries is going to be something that's going to be of certainly looked upon favorably by the purchaser, and that's going to mean that these issues are more likely to be resolved more rapidly. You want to make sure as the seller that your business very well. You don't want the due diligence phase to produce any surprises that you were unaware of. So basically, you need to make sure that you know your business sufficiently well so that when you're providing information about the target to the buyer, neither side has any particular surprises. And there are no circumstances. I've never come across a deal where there are no issues. There will always be issues. The buyer is going to accept that there will be some issues, but the buyer is most likely to want to know that those issues are well understood and that they're well in hand and that there's some sort of remediation plan in place. I mean, it may be the case that remediation takes place during the due diligence process, and unfortunately, the reality is that does happen frequently. But it's obviously better for the remediation to have taken place already. And that can be things that are as simple as, for example, if you realize that you don't have the specific rights that you need to a particular component of software, then you can get in touch with the rights owner of that software and say, can you let us have a license, please? Or can we buy a license from you? And this is something that happens pretty frequently. It's not unusual, and it can be surprisingly straightforward, actually. So what we're trying to do is to maintain a trust level between both of the parties. You're going to reduce the friction in a transaction if the trust level remains high. So you want to make sure that there's a minimal uncertainty as far as both sides are concerned, because if there is, then that's going to increase costs and time, and it's going to add additional hurdles to the closing process. So we want to try to avoid those if possible. So how does aligning transaction documents with the open chain specification help? Well, as we know, open chain presents an industry standard for open source compliance, and it's already been adopted by leading businesses in many fields. And I believe that open chain compliance, I think it's going to play a growing role in M&A transactions. First of all, because of the widespread adoption of open source. We mentioned that earlier. Open source is pervasive. It's everywhere at the moment, and that means that the associated licenses are also pervasive. And there are growing numbers of transactions in the technology sector, not necessarily simply because transactions within the sector are increasing, but also more and more businesses which wouldn't regard themselves as technology businesses effectively are, because they are using technology more and more. And as I've said at the outset, virtually all businesses have a significant software element to them these days. So that's another reason why it's becoming more relevant. And a company that is open chain compliant is going to find that there is significant reduction in friction with an M&A transaction, because it's going to have a lot of the information that it needs during the due diligence phase already to hand. And for those organizations that aren't open chain compliant, clearly it makes sense for them to move in that general direction. So because buyers need a true picture of the target during the purchase process, it means that essentially the purchaser of a software development company will very frequently need similar sorts of information about the code and the way it's developed to a potential purchaser of software from that customer. So if you look at the purpose of open chain, which is that organization which is purchasing software from a supplier can make its due diligence process on the software and the supplier more straightforward by insisting that the supplier is open chain compliant, that doesn't only apply to the sale of products by the supplier, but ultimately it's relevant as far as the sale of the entire business or the company is concerned as well. So it's very close alignment there. So that's why a lot of the questions you're going to be asking as the purchaser of a business which sells software are going to be very similar to the questions that you're going to be asking a company if you're purchasing software from it. So as I say, very, very close alignment. So it makes a lot of sense to use the open chain specification to provide the framework for the due diligence questionnaire or the share and asset purchase agreement, warranties and representations at the same time. So what do we actually let's contrast that with the existing approach at the moment. Now, part of the issue that we have is that what happens currently doesn't really reflect current development practice particularly well. questionnaires tend to ask, for lists of components, they ask about licenses. And sometimes they will go as far as to ask if any of the components involved a copyleft or they link to copyleft components, but they tend typically not to go much further than that. If I can make this work, what I will do is just give you an example of a real life questionnaire. So if I can share this. Okay, so this is the IP and Itg Diligence Questionnaire, which I hope you are able to see. And this is a precedent from PLC, and many lawyers will be familiar with PLC, Practical Law Company. So it's one of the major providers, certainly in the UK, of precedent documentation. And it's very influential. I mean, a lot of specialist firms, obviously, like ourselves, have developed our own specially tailored versions of these documents. But increasingly, organisations like PLC are sort of setting the agenda as far as the way that transactions look and standard transaction documents look. So it's quite instructive to have a look at their standard questionnaire. So I've made no amendments to this questionnaire at all. All I've done is I've just highlighted a couple of areas that we can look through quickly. So the relevant wording here, it's slightly weirdly structured. I think probably it makes sense actually if we look at the definition of IT first. So IT is any computer system or network related to processing information, and it specifically covers open source software. So basically, if you've got any system that's got some open source software inside it, that counts as IT. And then if you look at the definition of business IT, that's any IT owned or used or is available to, etc., the business or a business entity. So business IT is clearly covering any open source code that is used in the business. So then if we pop over to section 8, information technology, you'll see the question says, please provide details of all business IT. That's a lot. That basically means that you've got to provide details of every single piece of open source code that you've got, that you're using, that you have access to, etc. And if those items are not owned by a business entity, which open source code generally will not be, then you've got to explain the basis on which it's entitled to be used. Is it under license, lease, or other agreement? So, in extremis, you're basically being asked to provide a list of all of the open source software that's being used, all of the licenses that are associated with it, and so on. So that's a pretty onerous requirement that you've got there. So let's just go back to the presentation. But the sort of things that it doesn't ask about the build environment. It doesn't ask about the policies on which the code is included. It doesn't ask about training and awareness of policies in the legal context. It doesn't ask about roles and responsibilities. It doesn't ask about the compliance artifacts, and doesn't ask about the compliance issues and history. So this is broadly similar to a situation where, if as a purchaser you're purchasing a sausage factory, basically what you're doing is you're saying, right, give me details of all of the pork that you've got that you're going to make these sausages out of. So you've got details of all of the pork that's currently in the storeroom, and you can do tests on that pork. You can find out whether there's salmonella on that pork, and that gives you some information, but it's not particularly useful information. What's going to be much more useful to you is to be able to say, what are the processes that you use for acquiring your pork? Do you make sure that you acquire your pork from butchers and abattoirs that have certain processes in place? Are they all accredited under various health and safety legislation? Do you have processes for making sure that your storeroom is kept at a certain temperature? Do you have processes for tracking and tracing the pork to make sure that you know exactly which bit of pork goes into which sausage, and you know what the temperature has been? Have you got policies to make sure that when people handle the pork, they've cleaned, they're doing it in a suitably hygienic way? And all of this sort of thing is really of much more interest than as to whether all of the pork that you've currently got sitting in your storeroom is suitable to make sausages out of. And this is really the distinction that I'm sort of trying to draw at the moment between the way that people will typically be looking at due diligence from a software business acquisition perspective, and the way that they should be. And what I'm proposing is nothing that's the slightest bit radical at all. I mean, it's something that people have been doing in the context of financial due diligence for a very long time. I mean, you're not going to go into a company and say, right, we need you to disclose every single invoice that you've issued for the last 6 years. What will typically happen is that the accountants undertaking the due diligence, they will go in and they will look at a number of sample invoices to make sure they're appropriate, but they're much more interested in making sure that the procedures for generating the invoices, the procedures for making sure that the invoices turn into cash, collecting debts, etc., making sure that they all work. So what we're talking about is not looking at software so much in the context as being a thing, but looking at it being much more in the process, as a process, looking at the processes that generate the software. And I think anyone that's been involved in any form of due diligence process, you're going to find yourself a lot more comfortable if you're going into a business and you find that they present you with a set of nice, neat due diligence materials, and they provide you with details of the processes and procedures by which those due diligence materials and the underlying information has been generated and so on, rather than just looking at the raw information itself. And there is a place to look at that to analyze the raw information. This is not saying that you should not go and look at all of the pork to make sure that it hasn't got salmonella. This is where tools such as white sauce, black duck, fossology, etc., can usefully be used. But they're just part of the toolkit that an organization wants to use or should be using as part of the acquisition of a software business. They're far from the be-all and end-all, and you'll gain a lot more useful information when you're looking at the processes by which that software was created in the first place. And the reason this has become a problem is because the scale of integration of components into software has increased enormously. So whereas 10, 15 years ago, I'd be very frequently looking at due diligence on software acquisition, and a piece of software, it would typically contain open source components, but it might contain 20, 30, 40 open source components. You can track those easily. You can put them in a spreadsheet. You can examine them by hand. That's straightforward. Now we're very frequently looking at situations where you've potentially got many thousands of components interacting. It's not unusual to have 2, 3, 4,000 components going into a particular software build, and it's no longer feasible to look at each individual component, in the same way as it's not feasible for an accountant to go into any reasonably sized business and look at every single invoice that they've issued over a given period of time. It's not going to happen, and it's not worthwhile. So you've got to look at different, more cost-effective, more sensible ways of managing the risk. And another issue is the way that software is developed these days, much more along the means of it's a continuous integration and development cycle. So it means that it's much less a case of you'll get a new release of software every 6 months or a year or something like that, and you basically look at that particular release and do a snapshot of that. We've now got projects and products that are being updated nightly. You have nightly builds, so you may be able to examine all of the pork in the storeroom on a particular day, but a few days later, obviously there's going to be different pork in there and the situation may be different. And it's the same with software. You may be able to examine the software components on a particular day, but a few days later you're going to find there's a bunch of different components that have gone into the build. And that's why you need to focus on the way that in the same way as the sausage factory, you want to make sure that the new pork that's coming into your storeroom is compliant with all of your requirements. Then you need to make sure in the software context that all of the software components you're using are compliant with your requirements as well. Another issue is container technologies, and containers contain their own sort of interesting issues, because if you're providing your software inside a container, such as a Docker container, then you will typically find that when you ship that out to a client, a lot of when they run the container, a lot of the software that they're using at their end will actually extract components from all sorts of different places themselves. So you're not even shipping that material at all. What you're doing is you're essentially shipping some of your own material and a bunch of instructions on how to get the rest of the materials from out there on the web somewhere, and that contains a whole bunch of issues which can potentially cause you liability, but wouldn't really be picked up at all as far as the traditional mechanism for doing due diligence is concerned. And then finally, businesses are increasingly becoming involved in open source projects themselves, and one of the sensible ways to do that is that if you're particularly dependent on an individual project, I mean, let's, for sake of argument, I don't know, say MySQL, but you find that MySQL doesn't actually, MySQL is a bad example because I've just realised it doesn't have a particularly big community around it. Let's take MariaDB, which does have a big community around it. So if you're using the MariaDB project, which is it's a piece of database software, and you want to change the database software to make it do some specific things that you want it to do. Now, you can do that because it's available under an open source license, and that's not a problem. But what you may decide is that if you have got your separate version of MariaDB that you're using, and you've made your own modifications to it, I mean, it also, first of all, it causes problems as far as license compatibility is concerned, but it also means that you're effectively forking the MariaDB project, and you no longer have the benefit of the project itself to help you maintain your version of MariaDB. You may develop a little community around it, that would be fine, but surely it'd be a lot better if you can take your improvements to MariaDB and feed them back to the underlying project itself. And if you can do that, then it means that support for your modifications to MariaDB no longer solely your problem. Suddenly, it means that all of the community is going to be helping with them as well. So this process, it's called upstreaming, is something that companies are increasingly aware is a good thing. Makes it a lot easier for them to lower their maintenance and development costs. And this is something that really needs to be picked up as far as the due diligence process is concerned, because as a purchaser, you want to know what your target's involvement is in various open source projects. So there's an awful lot of time on that slide, but hopefully that sort of gives you enough background there. Right, let's see if I can go on to the next one. Right, hang on. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple examples here which explain how we've incorporated open chain specification requirements into a due diligence questionnaire. So if you read the open chain specification, you'll see that one of the requirements is that a written open source policy shall exist that governs open source license compliance of the supplied software. The policy shall be internally communicated. So that translates into a question on due diligence, which is, please provide details and a copy of any written open source policy that governs open source license compliance, license terms of software distributed by the target to third parties, and details of the internal procedure that the target has adopted to make its employees and officers aware of its open source policy. Now, if you are asking that question of an organization which is already open chain compliant, it's going to be extremely easy for them to comply because they will have that information to hand already, and they will be used to handing it out to purchasers. Certainly larger purchasers of their product will be asking these questions anyway. So the information is already there. And then you can use the same structure to translate this into the reps and warranties, into the appropriate transaction execution, documentation, share purchase agreement, whatever it happens to be, that says the company has a written open source policy that governs open source compliance, blah, 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 blah. So if you look at this, I take another example, and this ties in with what I was saying about contribution policy. So one of the requirements of the open chain specification is that if an organization considers contributions to open source projects, then it has a written policy that exists to deal with that. It shall be internally communicated, and there's a process that exists to make sure that it's implemented. And then we take that wording and map it very closely onto the due diligence questionnaire as well. So in relation to targets contributions to open source projects, can we see a copy of the open source contribution policy? Can we see a copy of the documented procedure that governs contributions? And can we see the procedure by which staff and officers are made aware of the policy? So it maps very, very closely. And ultimately, we can get to a situation where if the target is open chain compliant, we can simplify a lot of the warranties just by saying you're open chain compliant. For organizations that aren't, then clearly we'd have to expand on that somewhat. But I think you can get a feel for how this can greatly simplify the due diligence process, but also makes it more relevant because it brings out a lot of the information that is really important for a purchaser to know about, that the old form of the due diligence questionnaire wouldn't necessarily contain. And as I say, there's nothing particularly unusual about that. The sort of questions that we're looking at are very similar to the sort of questions that would be asked in other areas already. So if I come out of this and we go back in to the questionnaire, if I can just make that happen again. Right. Okay, it doesn't really like Max very much, this, unfortunately. But... right, so here we are back on the due diligence questionnaire. So if we look in a completely different area, for example, data protection and privacy, you'll see that I've highlighted in green here a number of questions, and they're much more similar to the sort of questions that we want to be asking of the way that the software is developed using the open chain framework. So in the case of due diligence for data protection, we're asking about policies, procedures, systems and processes to do a whole bunch of things about some backing up data, about what happens if there's a security breach, to ensure that we've vetted employees, the way that we're interacting with third parties. All of this sounds very, very familiar. It's all stuff that can be very easily mapped onto the sort of questions that we're asking about the software development process if you're using open chain as a framework. So there's nothing unusual about that at all. So let's take a look at some of the documentation that we have created in greater depth. I'm just going to give you a very high level overview of this. So hopefully, sorry, it just takes a little while to switch from one window to another. So right, now if I bring that one and get rid of this one, and then go back onto that page, and then reshare my screen. Right, and no, don't want to do that. Just want to move this around a bit so I can see it. So this is an example of the way that we're working on this currently. So we've got the open chain requirement in the left-hand column, and you'll see that there's a specific ID here, which maps directly over to the open chain specification. And then that maps over to a question in the due diligence questionnaire, which ultimately can be reflected in a warranty that's contained in the share purchase agreement, and so on. So if you look through here, then you'll see that these are all the requirements on the left-hand side of the open chain specification, and then each of them has been mapped onto a due diligence question, and also onto a warranty. And this is the point at which I would like to say thank you very much indeed to Jay, who's one of my colleagues who's done a lot of work on this with me. So I think he's on the call here at the moment as well. So I'd just like to express my thanks for that. So what we're planning on doing is making this document generally available. And I will stop sharing that and then go back onto the presentation again. Hold on 1 second. Which hopefully you can now see again. It doesn't like me moving my screen around. There we go. So what's the roadmap for this? What we want to do is to publish the document that I've just shown you, so due diligence questionnaire and sample set of warranties, and also produce some basic training, of which this presentation you're looking at now is going to form a part. We want to release it under CC0 because this is the standard that the Open Chain project adopts as well. So that basically makes it as easy as possible for people to use, adopt, change, reuse this documentation. It's the closest to public domain that's available in most jurisdictions. And that includes making them available to other law firms and potentially providers of precedent documents. And what I'd be very keen on getting some feedback from is people who are interested in getting involved in this project, because this is essentially, it's an open source project. And it fulfills all the criteria for an open source project. It would be good to have a community developing around this. And one of the things that we need to think about is the forum that we would want to do that. So would we want to do it on GitHub or GitLab, for example, or is that something that is a bit too esoteric for lawyers to deal with? Do we need perhaps something like Google Docs or Nextcloud, a specific Nextcloud instance or something like that? So I'd be very interested in hearing any comments that people have about that. So what are the benefits of this process? Well, it reduces the friction for due diligence and reduces acquisition costs. Hopefully that's the main thing that we're looking at here. But what it also means is that a single compliance exercise can benefit a target business's customers as well as potential investors and purchasers. So if there's something that the business thinks about at the outset, then it means that not only are they providing themselves a benefit to their to purchasers of their products and their services, but it also means they're providing a benefit at a later stage once they go through rounds of fundraising or an eventual exit, because it's going to make the due diligence process more straightforward. We think that if Open Chain is used as a roadmap, as a framework for this, then it means that it will increase the familiarity of businesses and their advisors with the Open Chain project as well, and it'll drive adoption of Open Chain specification and standard overall throughout the industry. And what I'd be really keen to see is that we get to the stage, which is what we've already seen in terms of big purchasers of product. So there's a number of purchasers. I mean, Scania, for example, which is part of the VW group, has publicly said that it is going to start requiring that its software suppliers are Open Chain compliant. But if we start to get to a situation where VCs and other investors recommend and require that their investee companies become Open Chain compliant, this will also help to drive adoption of the standard as well. And I say standard because for those of you who aren't aware, Open Chain has been submitted to ISO and it's in the process of being ratified as a standard. This is something that is due to happen in September of this year. So it's going to be much easier to persuade organizations, I think, to take on Open Chain compliance to the point when we can say it's ISO XXX. I think that'll certainly be a big profile raiser. So that concludes the talk. I mean, what I'd be really keen to hear from you if you have any particular questions, and I would be very, very happy to answer those. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, Andrew. Anybody who wants to ask questions probably is best to drop something into the public chat so we can see who's going to be up. Fantastic. I haven't seen this presentation before. Really interesting. I'm glad at the end you picked up a little bit on IPOing and other corporate transactions which might actually benefit from Open Chain, because listening to it, I almost thought we had allowed you to mistitle it and that it should be corporate transactions, not M&A.
Yeah.
I know I've worked with a number of organisations over the years who have been looking at IPO, or in several cases being acquired. And I've done the sort of component parts that you put into the Open Chain project for them, obviously without the benefit of a sort of standard like Open Chain, de facto, but rapidly becoming a full standard, as we know. And clearly this is going to be a huge solution. I was also really interested to hear you emphasize that the risk is in software, not open source. And I think it's something you and I know have talked about over drinks over the years, but it's one of those things where actually open source ends up in a much stronger position because so much diligence is done around it.
Exactly, yeah.
But the risk is much less than in fact it is with proprietary. It's something I'm personally really interested in, but it really came out from your talk.
Yeah, thank you.
I know Sammy wants to ask you some questions, but one thing I will mention at this point is that we will have Shane Coughlin of Open Chain talking to us around the point in time Open Chain becomes a standard, so probably late September, maybe early October. So this is not the last you will hear in future leaders on Open Chain. And I very much hope that we, both as future leaders and our legal and policy group, will be doing more with Open Chain. I'm sure that's not surprising when you see both Sammy and Andrew being based in the UK as two of the leaders who've really made all of this happen. Sammy, do you want to jump in?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Andrew. Really
Sammy.
good. I mean, it's excellent piece of work. Andrew, a couple of things as a comment. I think you know, I like your example of the sausage factory. Sort of, if you look at the standard format of the due diligence that you shown, I think it sort of doesn't make a distinction between the machine that creates the sausage versus the ingredients that end up in the sausage itself.
Yeah.
And one of the real key benefits with Open Chain is that you know what is being used internally versus what is being distributed, and that's obviously something that if a company is Open Chain conformant, part of the policy and the artifacts is that there is that distinction, knowing what is used internally within the company versus what actually ends up in the supplied software as referred to in the Open Chain specification. So that's really what you distribute to your customers and provide as a supplier of the software. So that's something that is really sort of, you know, in the training material. I think that sort of would be useful to make that distinction quite clearly, because again, if you're acquiring a company, well, you probably, the risk is really in what you distribute outside of your organization versus what you might be using as an infrastructure or the machine that makes the sausage in your example. So
yeah,
so
I think that's an extremely good point. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, and I think that's a very good point, and I think it's a question of the analogy being pushed a bit too far. If we talk about that the sausage rolls being sold in the works canteen may being of a different standard to the ones that are sold to Marks and Spencer.
But it is a very appropriate conversation in the UK at 5 to 1 on a Friday.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but that's very helpful. Thank you, Sammy.
The other thing I'm quite wondering, when you're doing due diligence, you're obviously, if your target is not Open Chain conformant, I ask the question: is there a slightly higher level set of questions that we can ask that gives you a bit more confidence in the activity that the target is doing? And what I'm referring to there is really the high level is that, do you have a policy? Do you have a process by which you manage open source? Do you make a distinction between? So again, obviously, if an organization is Open Chain conformant, that gives you that degree of confidence to sort of say, great, my risk here as a company acquiring the target is significantly reduced. But then there is they don't know what they're doing when it comes to open source. Zero confidence. Is there? Do you think there is something in between that we could sort of almost sort of say this is level 1, this is level 2,
Yeah.
in between that we can work on.
That's a really, really good point. And I think I probably should have emphasized that a little bit more. I mean, the idea is that, yeah, I mean, if the first question is, are you open chain compliant? And how long have you been open chain compliant? And the target comes back and says, yes, we are. And, we have been for 3 years. Then that's great. And, you know that, as long as they're telling the truth, then, the due diligence process should be fairly plain sailing. What I was really aiming at is saying, even if they're not open chain compliant, we're asking the same questions. So, we're asking, as you say, have we got an open source policy? And that's really, and I think this is probably something for a separate training session where I could take people through the questionnaire more slowly. And I think had I had an opportunity to do that, then you would have seen this is really what we're trying to drive at, is using if you say, have you got an open source policy? I mean, that is obviously a requirement of open chain, but because open chain is based on the set of policies and procedures that any well-run open source using developing business should have anyway, then you should be able to ask that question, even if they're not open chain compliant. You would hope that they would be able to say, yes, we do. Now, it may be the case that if they're capable of ticking, you send them out the due diligence questionnaire, they tick the box and say, oh, yes, we do that. Oh, yes, we do that. Oh, yes, we do that. Yeah, well, we do most of that, but it's not too difficult to change it. It could be the case that the remediation that they undertake as a result of the due diligence process means that they can say, actually, yeah, we can self-certify because we have been doing this for that long, and that will be great if they can do that. But I think you're absolutely right, and one of the other things that I'm working on in another context at the moment is basically a maturity model that looks at those precise points that you made. As the business clueless about open source, are they just sort of randomly grabbing pieces of code from all over the place, which all of us have come across businesses that do that. Are you pretty clued up on open source, but you actually just haven't really got round to formalizing what you're doing yet, because maybe you're quite a small organization and the CTO, who really knows their stuff, is acting as the gatekeeper for all of the code, but we can be really comfortable that they've done a pretty good job on that. Or have you got to the stage where you've got the practice procedures and you're comfortable that you're using them properly? And I'm always slightly embarrassed to ask targets where you are on the maturity model, but you can sort of in an interview on the phone, you can get a pretty good feel for that, and that is actually a really good way of calibrating the way that the due diligence exercise will go down the line. And I mean, it's an opportunity, if you're acting for the purchaser, to educate the seller and the target without necessarily being too patronizing about it.
Yeah, that's right. And again, I typically the first call that I have, I ask them to explain to me how they manage open source interaction, and sometimes you have organizations or targets that say, well, we don't use open source, and then oh, right, okay, so I don't really think that you know what you're doing. To some who obviously do some, but not everything that you would expect, that gives you the confidence. And again, my question, I guess, is there a half house? Can we think of different levels that we can ask people, as an initial filter, and then you go into the more detailed questionnaire?
I think that is an excellent idea, and I think it's the trouble is that it's one of those things that you and I have the experience of going through this process. We sort of do it instinctively, and I think it would be just a couple of slides, and I think it would be really helpful. For if this is a sort of knowledge transfer that's actually quite difficult to do.
That's right.
Because you don't think about it, because you do it instinctively. So I'm extremely grateful that you mentioned that, because I think that's a superb idea.
Yeah, I'll be more than happy to take that as part of our sort of Open Chain UK working group work.
Fantastic.
Thank you. And gentlemen, we're coming to time. A number of people have dropped, unfortunately. I'm sure lots of people will be listening to this as a download, and they may well be too late for this. But Andrew, why don't you wrap up by telling us a little bit about the Open Chain UK working group, if you don't?
So the simple answer is we don't know very much about it at the moment. Can I sort of park that for the time being, because Sammy and I are in the process of organising and arranging it at the moment.
say is that there's going to be one.
There is going to be one, yes. So the date is not quite in stone yet, but it nearly is. So I think 23rd of July off the top of my head. Just let me double check that.
Yeah, I think it is. Andrew,
right. Okay. So the fact that Sammy is not saying no,
you're right. You're right.
Yeah. Okay. So we're tentatively looking at 23rd of July in the afternoon. So we want to start an Open UK. An Open Chain UK working group. Obviously anyone at all is welcome to join that. It's going to be 2 or 3 hours long. It's going to involve an introduction by Shane Coughlin, who Amanda has mentioned. He's the program manager for the Linux Foundation, who runs the whole project. We also want to make it's not going to be completely legal. We want to get some engineers and some business people involved as well, and we've got quite a few ideas about who that's going to be. So it's going to involve fairly high level stuff, because we haven't got very much time to go through things in great detail, but things like we're going to look at sort of compliance tooling, practical ways to compliance, and hopefully a couple of case studies for organisations that have been through the process as well. But anyway, watch this space. We will provide more information as things develop. It will, of course, be virtual as well, but that sort of goes without saying these days.
But yeah, you can very definitely expect to see support both from the Future Leaders / LNP group at OpenUK, but also our broader supporters. Okay, well, look, thank you everybody for participating today. Thank you, Andrew. That was really informative.
Yeah, thank you.
Always good to have you here talking to us. And next week we have another world-leading speaker, Keith Berger, who has for 12 years been the Chief Executive of Open Invention Network. I will make sure that Keith tells us some good old juicy stories about some of the experiences he's had running and building the world's biggest defensive IP organization, which is a patent pool protecting Linux. He'll also talk a little bit about the background of patents and some general patent information. And I am doing my best to see if we can have Neil McGovern join that day. You will all be aware of the recent GNOME patent settlement. If Neil's available to join, he will. He will also be speaking to us, interestingly, on the 12th of June, talking about desktops and the history of open source around the desktop. So either way, you're going to have Keith Berger on 5th of June and Neil McGovern, ED, at the GNOME Foundation on the 12th. So watch the space. Look forward to seeing you next Friday. And thanks again, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
Bye.
Thanks, Andrew. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.